Hello and welcome to this session, which is about evidence leaders in education. My name is David Bailey and I'm Director of Carmel Research School. And in this session, what I'm going to do is to talk about these three things. So the purpose of the session is to explain what being an evidence leader in education involves, an ELE, to outline the ELE recruitment process, and to outline the commitment, training and support that ELEs will receive. So I'm going to start by talking about what is an evidence leader in education. So an evidence leader in education is a type of system leader. As a research school, Carmel can appoint ELEs. Now they're equivalent in status to the other system leaders appointed by the teaching schools and the National College of Teaching and Leadership, the NCTL, such as the SLEs and the National Leaders of Education. One of the key components of being an ELE is that they are evidence-informed practitioners. So I'm going to unpick that a little bit by talking about, first of all, what exactly is a research school. Now, a research school belongs to the Research School Network, and the Research School Network is across England, and as you can see by the map, there are 39 schools in total, 11 what we describe as founding schools, 11 which were set up in opportunity areas, which are areas of particularly high deprivation. And there are also 17 schools which were appointed in 2019, which included Carmel Research School. And of those 17, 7 of those were associate research schools. So why were the research schools set up? So the research schools were set up by the Education Endowment Foundation, and the EEF's goal is to break the link between family income and educational outcomes, and therefore that is the aim of the Research School Network. Now, the key thing is we want to improve the outcomes of those children and life chances, particularly for pupils who come from disadvantaged backgrounds. What research has shown consistently is that they start behind, and as they get older, they get further and further behind those who don't come from a disadvantaged background. So that gap starts at about 4 months, and by the time they leave secondary school, it is nearly 20 months different. What is system leaders? So the whole point of a system leader is somebody who works beyond their own setting. So they can be a senior or middle leader or another expert practitioner. And the kind of work that they would do include sharing effective practice, providing coaching, and sometimes a formal deployment to improve a school in challenging circumstances, so school improvement work. And ELEs are no different. They work in those same areas. One of the key differences between ELEs and SLEs and NLEs is that ELEs, as we appoint them, aren't required to give a specific time commitment. So what we would do is accredit an ELE with a status rather than an employment contract or a time commitment from their current employer. And the reason for that is that our need varies quite a lot. And some of the need is local, but because research schools don't have a geographic remit, if they can work in areas nationally and even internationally potentially, it wouldn't necessarily be fair to ask either the person or the employer to commit to a certain number of days, because we don't know where those days would be or whether that would fit the person involved. So what we would do is negotiate each deployment with the head of the organisation and in consultation with the person who is to be deployed to make sure that that fits with their availability. So in this table, what we've got is an approximate equivalence to try to match across how the current system leaders, which are in the second column, with our ELEs and suggested ELE structure. What we are looking to have are 5 layers of ELEs. The first layer is a governance ELE. We think they're necessary because the evidence-informed governance is a key aspect of school improvement, and they would be similar in role to a national leader of governance. So they would typically be a chair of governors, and they would be focused on supporting governors in their work. Then we have an executive ELE, which is very similar to an NLE, a National Leader of Education. They would be at a very senior level. They'd be looking at the strategic deployment of other ELEs and supporting the research school at that executive level. Our senior ELEs would be senior colleagues in school and would be associated with either school improvement, teaching schools, research schools. There might be a deputy head in a school. They would typically coordinate the work of other ELEs, particularly in complex projects. So a senior ELE might oversee a complex project which deploys other ELEs within it. And the ELEs, similar to an SLE, have typically a post holder responsibility, but there might be an expert practitioner in a particular area instead, and they would be the ones doing a lot of the supporting work with the classroom practitioners at a similar level. We also have put in what we describe as an aspiring ELE, and that's for somebody who isn't yet at the position to be able to work as an ELE. For various reasons that might be the case, but would really benefit from accessing the training and support that the ELEs will be able to access, and I'll mention a bit about that later in this session. So the key thing is that those people could then access that and use that for their own professional development, and they might be deployed alongside an ELE to carry out some of the work with supervision. There are three parts to the application. The first thing is that the vacancies are listed with all the other vacancies on the BHCET website under the Carmel College vacancies. So in there's an advert, there are frequently asked questions, and there is an application form. In terms of the application itself, some key things to think about is there is a grid at the front of the application which looks at the skill areas that an ELE would typically have and allows you to kind of think through what you have done in your own practice and what you would be able to evidence. So essentially, we're looking for as many or a full range of ticks if we can, but aspiring ELEs in particular might look at having a majority of these, and perhaps identifying where the gaps might be would help them as they work towards becoming an ELE. Now, in the right-hand column, it's about the nature and experience and length of time. Now, it's very easy to write too much in that, so I would just focus on the role and or the number of years that you've been doing that kind of experience. So it just needs to be very, very light touch in that column, and in the text later in the form you can identify specifically what that nature was like, but it's just some headings really in that application there. Otherwise you'll find yourself writing too much in that section. So the application itself, there are a limited number of words on these questions. It's meant to keep things concise and also allow you to focus your efforts. So we're well aware that experienced practitioners might struggle to fit what they've done into those words. So just providing examples from your practice rather than trying to put everything in might be the most appropriate thing to do if you have a great deal of experience. Now, in particular, we've picked out these because these are the things that ELEs will typically be asked to do. We need to know that your reason for thinking about evidence-based practice, but also it's focused on impact, and impact in terms of leading other people to change their practice and become more evidence-informed. And in particular, working in an evidence-informed way yourself. In terms of the actual kind of things you would put in there, the focus really is about the impact and how that matches up with some of the things I'm going to suggest might be the tools of an ELE in a moment. I'll bring you back to this core purpose. Obviously, it's very difficult for everyone to have just worked with disadvantaged pupils, but since the work of an ELE is focused about supporting the research school network, if you have several examples and you were looking for one to choose, thinking about ones where you're looking to support or have supported disadvantaged pupils in particular align with the goal of the research school network. So that will help you to focus the examples that you might choose. Once we've got the questions, there's also an interview. Now in the interview, there will be a brief task. There will be a brief presentation, which will be just 5 minutes on a specific question. And there will also be some questions. Now, the task, you will be given a small number of articles, 2, maybe 3 articles as sources of evidence, and you will be asked to give your thoughts on those as sources of evidence. So in a moment, what I'm going to do is give you some extracts from other presentations where I have given some pointers about things that an evidence-informed practitioner would typically do, which have been out there in the public domain, but it just helps you to focus on what those look like. The presentation is focusing around implementation, and I use that word very carefully, and again we'll point again to a tool which will help think about what we mean by that. Finally, the questions will be focused on the evidence-informed practitioner aspect, and again I'll show you what I mean by that, including how you've overcome any challenges or difficulties, because an evidence leader in education will have difficulties and challenges to overcome. So it will be really interesting to see how you've done that. One of the things we mean by evidence-informed, now I will be really clear about the language here, because a lot of overlapping language is used. So you'll hear evidence-based, evidence-informed, and just to be clear that we think they're slightly different. An evidence-based practitioner will use the evidence base. An evidence-informed practitioner really does use their professional expertise as part of that use of evidence to help them to filter and to choose and allocate the evidence appropriately. Now, there are 3 pieces of supporting reading, which I think will be really helpful. Many people will have seen these already, but I will direct you to these as toolkits that an ELE would typically use. So the first one is the EEF implementation guidance, and there's a link there to that, and I think lots of people will have seen that already. Secondly, I think people will have also seen the Sutton Trust EEF Teaching and Learning Toolkit, and I'll give some pointers about how that might be best used. The third will be perhaps less common, the IEE Engaging with Evidence Guide. So the IEE is the Institute of Effective Education, which is based at York University, and they give a really helpful guide about engaging with evidence and the kind of filters that an ELE might apply. So I'm going to highlight some things about the implementation guidance that an ELE would typically be considering. So the first thing to say is this is the poster that comes with the implementation guides that summarizes the process. There's a whole range of different tools with this, but this is probably one of the more important ones because it summarizes the whole process. And one of the things that people often miss is that implementation begins and then it's often quite a long time before you actually do anything. So this implementation process is actually quite long, it's deliberately slow and is intended to slow schools down rather than rushing into quick decisions, which is often a mistake that schools make, trying to do too many things, doing them too quickly and poorly prepared. So the implementation process is deliberately slow and has that halfway through before you actually do anything so that you can really explore issues and think carefully about what that is. So an ELE would be really clear that implementation has a lot of preparation. They would also be aware of the different stages within each of the different sections of the process. So the explore phase, as it's described, having 3 sections to it, including systematically exploring programs or practices to implement. And I'll give some further guidance on that in a second. In the second section, it's about preparing the ground for successful implementation. And again, that often involves a lot of staff training, having a clear plan and making sure that everyone is ready before you actually implement that. Because if the circumstances aren't right, then there's no point in actually trying to rush something through. Now, the third section is around delivery. And this is where knowing your data and helping you to understand how well the implementation process is actually working and whether it's working or not would be something to consider. And in the final stage, this is around sustaining this, and actually sustaining this might be rolling around to the next cycle of implementation on the same thing. So often an implementation might be phased, so the early group might grow at this point and you might have more teachers or leaders involved with this process, and you treat that as a new cycle. And I'll also highlight this. So an ELE would be watching for planning for sustaining and scaling at the outset. So they would have in mind the next phase of the implementation before they started the first phase. So they'll be thinking ahead. It's also worth pointing out that there is a really clear implementation plan template along with the implementation guidance that helps you identify your problems, look at how you would go about doing this, and focusing on what's described as the active ingredients. In other words, what's the key thing that's going to make the difference? And then focusing on what that would actually look like and how you would see that it was working as it should be, and then hopefully the desired outcomes, which is the solution to the problem that you identified in the first place. So essentially, it's a bit like a logic model. It takes you through from one stage to the next, and it's intended to give you some guidance as to your problem you're solving and what the solution might look like and the steps in between. And then monitoring that carefully so that if it isn't going to plan, you go back to see where it's breaking down and try to work out how you can fix that before you move on. So it is meant to be an active process. Now, I mentioned a little bit about diagnosing, and as part of that, one of the tools that an ELE might use would be the Teaching and Learning Toolkit, along with other sources of evidence. An ELE would be able to weight how valuable the evidence would be as well, and I'll give some further thoughts on that too. So the Teaching and Learning Toolkit is something that I think most people are familiar with, and the ability to sort these things by the month's progress and give the overall evidence strength and the cost gives us a good idea of what kinds of things we might use to solve a particular problem. However, there are some notes of caution, and I will just point these at this point now as well. The first is that these tend to give a broad brush overview. So just picking out behaviour interventions, for example, which is a moderately costly, reasonably strong evidence, and in general tends to give 3 months of additional progress, you might think that's a good thing to do. However, if you look at the bottom of this, so this was found by clicking on that heading for behaviour interventions, you will note that down the bottom there's always a bit of detail. So if you were thinking about doing a behaviour intervention, and this is something that schools often miss, is they don't go to the bottom of the page and look at the key recommendations as to what they should consider. So an ELE would point them to these recommendations and make sure that they'd accounted for them. They would also look at the specific intervention. And just to give an example of why that matters, if you look at the behaviour one on the right hand side, you can look at the behaviour interventions and find some detail about them. And it gives you an example like the good behaviour game, which has been evaluated. So it tells you about this. It tells you what the summary says. And crucially, whilst behaviour interventions on average give an additional progress of 3 months, this particular one showed no additional progress. It's also appropriate for Key Stage 2. So if you're trying to do this in a secondary school, that would also raise some alarms. And if you click even further into that and read that further down, you can see which schools it was tried in. So you can see that the schools here were state maintained. There were 77 schools. It gives you the breakdown of the free school meal, the SEND profile of those schools, and their Ofsted gradings too. The reason that matters is that if you actually look at the toolkit, it always gives the averages. And this is a bit of the behind the scenes about the toolkit, because there's the same headings and each of those dots represents a different project that's been evaluated to give those average figures. So if you look at behaviour interventions, you can see there is a huge spread between the very best, which is over here on the right hand side, and one that doesn't actually make any difference at all. And then the good behaviour game is about here. So there are better interventions and worse interventions as long as the context matched. So it is worth actually having an understanding that all of those averages might give some pointers, but actually it is all down to the right implementation for the right context in the right way. And that's a little bit experimental, and an ELE would understand that. So if something wasn't quite working as planned, maybe it's the wrong intervention, or maybe it's just that it's not been implemented it very well, and trying to understand those things is what an ELE might be able to do. Some of the biggest ranges include things like the teaching assistants and behaviour interventions. So reports about how ineffective teaching assistants are, well, if they're well deployed, they can be brilliant, and this table shows that. Other interventions are much closer together. So arts participation are actually generally positive. Although it's small, it's pretty consistent. So it is worth knowing that actually the actual intervention matters. One of the things an ELE might do is guide a school through a process like this. And I've picked a science example here, but equally it could be improving pupils' reading, or it could be skills in their mathematical ability. It could be anything. So I've just picked a generic problem here. And what an ELE would do is help a school solve this problem. Now, if you ask this problem in a typical staff room, what you might get is a range of different responses. So an ELE would be able to look at those different responses and to give some thoughts about how those might rank in terms of the strength of the evidence, which relates to the task that we'll set in the interview. So actually understanding that some sources of evidence are more reliable than others. The thing is, it's not as simple as it first seems. So, for example, although generally speaking, people tend to rate this quite low, actually, this might be the best intervention. But what this would do is raise a lot more questions. So this in itself wouldn't answer very many of those questions. Equally, lots of people rate this quite highly because it's a reason we'll explore in a minute. But again, there might be some further questions to ask. So generally speaking, an ELE would know what to believe. And here are a kind of a slightly broader range of different sources of evidence that could be used to help decide what might solve a problem. And this is where I'll link you back to one of the supporting documents, because actually deciding which of these is better or worse, it has some rules to it. They're not hard and fast, but it gives you some guidance here. Now, one of them I've not pointed you to, which is something that when we were putting together our SSIF projects, the Strategic School Improvement Fund projects, the Department for Education put out this evidence review document here. And as part of this, they kind of indicated that certain sources of evidence were stronger than others. Now, the reason I've not pointed this out is because I have a copy of the original source of information for this here, which is about nursing research. And this actually came from a medical background. So its applicability to education is probably okay, but maybe tenuous in places. Probably what is a better source of information is the one in the document we've referred you to, which is that IEE evidence guide. And on page 9, there is a summary table. And what that does is it tells you what each of those different sources of information is likely to tell you. So while things like systematic reviews and meta-analyses score quite well, and those are both technical terms. So a meta-analysis is where a researcher takes a whole bunch of different studies and tries to draw themes out. And a systematic review is where you take things and systematically include or exclude sources of evidence before you draw some conclusions. So those give you some guidance as to they're quite good sources of evidence, but they don't tell you some things. So meta-analysis won't tell you whether your staff or pupils will actually take to this, but a survey would. So some of these sources of evidence have different values. So actually deciding might include using more than one of them to tell you. But it gives you a bit of a rule of thumb as to how you might decide whether something is worth reading or what questions you might ask as a result. Now, going back to our original ABCD, that blogs and social media one doesn't tell you an awful lot. So that Twitter one is not likely to give you a lot of information. Source B, which was kind of looking at books and theory, if you like, again, might tell you how it works, but not whether it works. You probably need to do an experiment for that. And that's what we'd encourage our ELEs to encourage practitioners to do, is if they think they've got a good idea, experiment with it, but be prepared to see how it keeps working using that implementation process. And finally, that Sutton Trust EEF toolkit is amongst these here. So it's the highest value source of evidence, but might not tell you everything. Finally, just thinking about the training and support an ELE would receive. So this diagram kind of describes what the job of an ELE might be and how each of the different elements of the research school network might support them. So we would like the ELEs to know about the evidence base. And the research school provides something called deep dives, which goes into the evidence base on the particular areas that the ELE might be asked to support. So, for example, if you're looking at trying to do something around curriculum, the research school network has a deep dive on curriculum that an ELE could watch and get the basics of the evidence base around curriculum to feel more knowledgeable about how that works. The research schools also provide structured programs, and those programs train teachers and leaders how to actually do some of these things. And to help the ELEs, we have train the trainer sessions, which helps the ELE understand what it is they've got to do with that specific program. So the things to actually include or exclude, some pointers about how you would deliver that, and some things to watch out for. We also want ELEs to be able to deliver the highest quality professional development. And locally, through Carmel Research School, they will get local sessions to support with evidence-informed professional development. And that includes how to deliver effective blended professional development. So that if you are setting up a training session, this is particularly relevant for those of you who might do something to support a school in a more bespoke fashion. It's that support is to help you to do that with a strong evidence-informed background. So you're doing the things that will have the biggest bang for the buck, if you like. We also want ELEs to develop their consultancy skills and to be clear about how change is led within the research school network. So again, we will provide support as to what that looks like and how to carry that out using that implementation process, and provide some guidance with that. Because we've got a structured support of ELEs, the idea is that some people will be able to provide mentoring and coaching for an ELE as they're deployed. And that's at all levels. So it's not just for the aspiring ELEs. It means that there would be somebody to go to who has done some of this already and could support you in terms of helping the school you're asked to support with, or the program you're asked to support. And finally, we want ELEs to bring examples from their own practice. Now, the Research School Network have people from across the network who've recorded case studies and videos of things that they've done which help exemplify things. But equally, there will be things that every practitioner will bring from their own classrooms or from the classrooms of those they've supported locally that they could talk about to provide support. And we want to share that across our ELEs, and that's something that we'd include as part of our support. So in the centre of all of the overlapping ideas is the ELE's evidence-informed practice that's developed from these areas.